There are movies you watch once, and then there are movies you've seen so many times you could recite them in your sleep. Young Frankenstein is one of those. But even if you've had the film practically memorized since the 70s, there's a good chance you've been letting certain things slip right past you. Here are 20 small details you missed in Young Frankenstein.
Gorilla! Is that what you're telling?
Detail 20, the idea came from a coffee break. The whole film started with an offhand conversation. Mel Brooks was still in the middle of shooting Blazing Saddles out in the Antelope Valley when Gene Wilder pulled him aside over a cup of coffee and pitched the idea of a grandson of Victor Frankenstein, someone who was deeply embarrassed by the family name and wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of it. Brooks pushed back at first. He pointed out that Hollywood had already done the son, the cousin, the brother-in-law, but then the grandson angle clicked. What made it funny, Brooks realized, was the shame. The idea of a man named Frankenstein who insists the name is pronounced Frankenstein and who lectures at an American medical school and tries very hard to be taken seriously. That was the engine the whole film needed. From that casual, unplanned conversation on a dusty film set, one of the great comedies of the 1970s was born. Wilder and Brooks then co-wrote the screenplay together, with Wilder driving much of the script's structure and emotional logic. And Wilder insisted from the very beginning that he would only play the lead role under one firm condition, which brings us to the next detail.
Hey, boy, is this the Transylvania station?
Yeah, track 29.
Detail 19. Wilder banned Brooks from appearing on camera. Gene Wilder had one non-negotiable demand before agreeing to star in Young Frankenstein. Mel Brooks could not appear in the film on screen in any meaningful role. Wilder believed that Brooks had a natural habit of breaking the fourth wall, of winking at the audience, whether he intended to or not. In every previous Brooks film, the director had played a visible part. Wilder felt that kind of presence would shatter the carefully built illusion of the story. Brooks agreed to stay off camera, and he stuck to it. The deal held. For a director who had always been part of his own movies, that was no small concession. And the film is arguably better for it. The world of Young Frankenstein feels sealed, lived in, and complete in a way that might not have survived Brooks turning up and nudging the audience.
Words are useless. Your grandfather used to play it to the creature he was making.
Then it was you.
Detail 18. Brooks still snuck himself into the sound design. Keeping himself off camera didn't mean Brooks disappeared from the film entirely. He voiced several background sounds personally. The howling wolf heard during the carriage ride to the castle. That's Mel Brooks. When Frederick throws a dart and hits a cat off screen, the shriek you hear. Also Mel Brooks. He provided the sound of the train whistle as well. And in one brief background moment, he can be spotted as an uncredited Transylvanian villager, face turned away from the camera, visible only for a second. It was a small act of rebellion, staying technically within the rules Wilder had set while still finding a way to leave a personal mark on every reel of the film. Brooks had built his career partly by being present in his own work, and going entirely invisible wasn't something that came naturally. The wolf howl, the cat shriek, the train whistle, they're scattered through the first act like little signatures, there for anyone who knows to listen for them.
Igor, release the safety valve on the main wheel. Yes, master.
Detail 17. The gargoyles in the lab have Mel Brooks' face. Here's one that almost nobody catches on a first watch, or a fifth. If you look closely at the decorative gargoyle carvings built into the walls and set dressing of the laboratory, the faces were modeled after Mel Brooks himself. They're easy to miss because your eye is almost always drawn to whatever action is happening in the foreground. Wilder throwing switches, equipment sparking, Peter Boyle strapped to the table. But the gargoyles are there in every lab scene, staring out from the stone, and they all share the same face. For a director who agreed to stay invisible, Brooks managed to be watching from the walls the entire time.
Ain't got no body.
Detail 16, the real lab equipment. From the 1931 original. When Brooks started preparing the production, he tracked down Kenneth Strickfaden, the man who had built all of the crackling, sparking, arcing electrical machinery for the original 1931 Frankenstein. Strickfaden was semi-retired and living in the Los Angeles area, with the entire collection sitting in storage in his home garage. He had held on to everything for more than 4 decades. Brooks made a deal to rent the equipment, and when Strickfaden threw the switch on set, every machine fired up exactly as it had more than 40 years earlier. Not replicas, the real coils, the real switches, the real electrical arcs from the classic. The machinery still worked. Standing in the Young Frankenstein laboratory in 1974, you were looking at the same sparking equipment that had lit up Boris Karloff's face in 1931. As part of the arrangement, Strickfaden received a proper screen credit, something he had never been given on any of the original Universal pictures, despite having built the most visually distinctive props in the entire series. Young Frankenstein would turn out to be the last film Strickfaden was ever involved with.
What else can I say?
My sweet love.
The hair. Just been said.
Sorry.
Detail 15. The studio fought the black and white decision. Shooting in black and white in 1974 was genuinely unusual, and Fox executives made their feelings known. Color film had been the industry standard for decades by that point, and the studio reportedly offered more money and larger promotional support if Brooks would agree to shoot in color. He refused. Cinematographer Gerald Hirschfeld even proposed a middle ground compromise. Begin the film in black and white and gradually transition to color as the story progressed. Brooks wasn't interested in any version of that. He wanted the film to look like a rediscovered Universal horror picture from the 1930s. And he understood that black and white wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was the whole foundation the parody was built on. Without it, the joke doesn't land the same way. The film laboratory that processed the footage hadn't even handled a black and white negative in over 6 years by the time production began. Hirschfeld had to make specific requests about how the negative would be developed to push the contrast in exactly the right direction. High contrast, minimal middle tones, to match the visual style of the James Whale originals. It required deliberate technical effort at every stage just to make the film look like something from another era.
Throw the first switch! You've got it, master!
Detail 14. Igor's shifting hump was never in the script. The running gag where Igor's hump moves from one shoulder to the other across different scenes was entirely Marty Feldman's own invention. He had been quietly repositioning the prosthetic between takes for several days before anyone on the crew noticed what he was doing. When Brooks realized it, instead of reshooting scenes for continuity, he left every frame exactly as it was and had a line written into the script. Frederick points it out directly, and Igor simply replies, "What hump?" It's one of the most quoted exchanges in the film, and it almost wasn't there at all. It exists only because Feldman was quietly pulling a private joke on his director and got caught at exactly the right moment.
Hello. Would you like to have a roll in the hay?
Detail 13. Madeline Kahn and Terry Garr swapped roles. The casting of the 2 leading women nearly went the opposite direction. Madeline Kahn was originally set to play Inga, the cheerful and eager laboratory assistant. Terry Garr had auditioned for the role of Elizabeth, Frederick's composed and fussy fiancée, but Kahn decided she preferred Elizabeth, and rather than lose either actress, Brooks asked Gar to come back in and try Inga, specifically with a German accent. Gar stepped into the accent mid-sentence without hesitation, as if she'd been doing it her whole life. Brooks handed her the part on the spot. Both women gave performances that feel absolutely irreplaceable, which makes it all the more remarkable that they very nearly played each other's characters.
A little while longer when I can give myself to you without hesitation, when I can be totally and unashamedly
Detail 12, No Tongues. Was Madeline Kahn improvising? In the bedroom scene where Frederick leans in to kiss Elizabeth goodnight, Kahn's perfectly dry response, no tongues, was not in the script. Kahn made it up in the moment, and it fit the character so completely that nobody suggested cutting it. It stayed in the film without any alteration. Elizabeth is someone who approaches everything in life, including a goodnight kiss from her fiancé, with careful, considered caution and a faint air of disapproval. She is a woman who travels with matching luggage and a strong sense of how things should be done. Kahn found the whole character in 2 words. It's the kind of line that feels like it must have been written. It's so perfectly placed, which is exactly what makes it such a good piece of improvisation. Kahn was nominated for a Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actress for her work in the film, and it's hard to watch her in any scene and wonder why.
I know what it means to be cold and hungry. Yes, and how much it means.
Detail 11. Gene Hackman worked uncredited and ad-libbed the closing line. Gene Hackman was already an Academy Award winner in 1974, known almost exclusively for intense dramatic roles. He had no track record in comedy, but he was a tennis friend of Wilder's, and after one of their games, he mentioned that he'd like to try something funny. Wilder wrote the role of Harold the Blind Hermit with Hackman specifically in mind. Hackman shot his entire scene in a single day and appeared without screen credit, reportedly working without pay as a favor. The line that closes the scene, where Harold casually mentions he was just about to make espresso, was entirely ad-libbed. The crew laughed so hard and so completely that the scene cuts to black right there, because there was no possibility of carrying on. They got one good take before everyone fell apart, and that's the one that's in the film.
Is an ugly sink, und what you get.
Detail 10. Inspector Kemp is a direct reference to Son of Frankenstein. Kenneth Mars plays Inspector Kemp with a thick German accent, a monocle, and a prosthetic arm that seems to have its own agenda. That very specific combination is a deliberate nod to Inspector Krog from the 1939 Universal film Son of Frankenstein, in which Lionel Atwill played a similar one-armed figure of authority with a distinctly theatrical manner. In the village assembly scene, one official even mentions being aware of what Frankenstein is up to based on 5 previous experiences. A direct reference to the first 5 Universal Frankenstein films. The filmmakers were paying close attention to the source material they were spoofing, and they built in these references carefully enough that you'd only catch them if you'd done your homework. Detail 9. The Puttin' on the Ritz number almost didn't make the film. Mel Brooks was genuinely opposed to including the song and dance number where Frederick and the monster perform in white tie and tails. He felt it was too theatrical, too far removed from the plot, and that it would feel out of place. Gene Wilder, who had co-written the screenplay, disagreed completely and pushed hard to keep it in, arguing that the scene was necessary to show how fragile and unpredictable Frederick's hold over the monster actually was. Brooks resisted for a while, Eventually, Wilder wore him down. The scene stayed. It went on to become one of the most celebrated moments in the entire film and one of the most replayed clips in Mel Brooks' entire filmography. The number was filmed on location at the Mayfair Music Hall in Santa Monica, the only one of 2 scenes in the whole production shot outside a studio.
Dr. Frankenstein.
Detail 8, Walk This Way, and the Aerosmith connection. Early in the film, Igor tells Frederick to walk this way, meaning simply to follow him, and then limps off down the corridor with his characteristic hunch. Frederick, without thinking, copies the limp exactly. It's a brief gag, quickly passed over. What many people don't realize is that Aerosmith's 1975 song, Walk This Way, was reportedly inspired by that scene. Members of the band caught a late-night screening of Young Frankenstein, saw the exchange, and used the phrase as the title. Steven Tyler has spoken about the scene in interviews over the years in connection with the song. The band never made a single formal, definitive statement locking in the exact origin story, but the timing and the account have followed the song consistently enough that it has become part of the film's lasting legacy. A throwaway corridor gag from a 1974 comedy ending up as the title of one of the most recognizable rock songs of the decade is the kind of detail that is easy to wave off as coincidence until you hear it often enough.
He is as gentle as a lamb. Stand back! Stand back!
Detail 7. A real member of the Frankenstein family appeared as an extra. Clement von Frankenstein, a member of the genuine aristocratic house of Frankenstein, the real German family from whose name Mary Shelley reportedly drew the title of her novel, appeared in Young Frankenstein as a background extra. He was going by the stage name Clement St. George at the time, having set aside his real surname out of concern that it would work against his acting career. So, somewhere in the background of a scene in this parody of Frankenstein, there is a person whose legal name is actually Frankenstein, standing uncredited among the extras, watching a comedy about his own family name. That detail is almost too good to be true, and it is completely true. Detail 6. The score was built to sound 40 years older than it was. Composer John Morris, who had also scored Blazing Saddles for Brooks earlier that same year, approached the music for Young Frankenstein with a clear and specific goal. It needed to sound as though it could have been written and recorded for a Universal Studios horror picture in the early 1930s. Morris studied the orchestration and dramatic style of that era, the sweeping brass lines, the gothic string arrangements, the sudden stings, and built everything around that sensibility. He was not trying to mock those scores or play them for laughs. He was trying to genuinely replicate their texture, their weight, their sense of dread and grandeur. The result is a score that sits completely at home alongside the black and white photography and the 1930s style scene transitions. It doesn't call attention to itself as a period imitation. It simply sounds like it belongs there. That restraint is harder to pull off than it looks, and it's one of the quiet reasons the film holds up so well. Morris went on to score several more Brooks films, but many who know the work consider Young Frankenstein his finest collaboration with the director.
Inga, may I present Frau Blucher?
Detail 5. The Frau Blucher horse gag has a simpler explanation than the famous story suggests. For decades, a popular explanation circulated for why the horses whinny and panic every time someone says the name Frau Blucher. The story goes that Blücher means glue in German, and since glue was historically rendered from horses, the animals react with instinctive dread. It's a neat story, and it spread widely. Cloris Leachman even repeated it on NPR in 2009, saying Mel Brooks had told it to her personally. The problem is that it isn't true. Blücher is a completely ordinary German surname with no connection whatsoever to the German word for glue. The name bears no resemblance to any German or Yiddish word for glue, standard, slang, or archaic. Blücher is, essentially, the German equivalent of a surname like Jones. According to Gene Wilder in DVD supplementary material, the joke is simply that Frau Blücher is such a terrifying and unknowable presence that the horses react to her name the way characters in old melodramas reacted whenever the villain was mentioned, with a dramatic musical sting and visible, unreasoning fear. Wilder added that nobody quite knows what she does to those horses when no one is around. The glue story is a piece of folklore that grew up around the film and took on a life of its own, which, in its way, says something about how much people love finding hidden layers in things that don't actually have them.
Es heaven is my witness. He will curse.
Detail 4. The first cut of the film was considered a complete failure. When the first assembly cut of Young Frankenstein came together, the reaction from everyone involved, including Brooks and Wilder, was that it wasn't working. The original cut was reportedly nearly twice the length of what eventually reached theaters, and the consensus was that it was slow, uneven, and far too loose. Some accounts suggest it ran as long as 3 hours. Brooks and Wilder went through an extended and grinding editing process, cutting joke after joke that didn't earn its place. Their working principle was direct. For every joke that landed, roughly 3 didn't. Everything that failed to pay off was removed, regardless of how much time or effort had gone into shooting it. Entire roles were trimmed or disappeared entirely. John Carradine had recorded voice work as the late Dr. Frankenstein, and Leon Askin had filmed scenes as the executor of the Baron's will. Both were cut from the final print. The version that premiered in December 1974 was the direct result of that ruthless process. Both Brooks and Wilder later said they were far happier with the edited film than they had been with anything they watched in that first rough cut.
Don't speak.
Detail 3. The blind villager in the mob scene is Gene Hackman. During the climactic mob sequence, when the torch-carrying villagers surge through the streets, one figure stands out immediately. He's the only member of the crowd without a torch. If you watch carefully, that same man walks directly into a tree. That is Harold the Blind Hermit, played by Gene Hackman. Since his character cannot see, he naturally has no torch and no reliable sense of where he's going. Hackman appeared in this crowd scene just as he appeared throughout the rest of the film, completely without screen credit, blending into the background, easy to miss entirely if you don't know to look for him.
Creatures either congenitally or artificially proportionate in size.
Something like.
Detail 2. The film was shot almost entirely on studio backlots. Despite looking as though it was filmed somewhere deep in a foggy European countryside, nearly the entire production of Young Frankenstein was shot on sound stages and backlots at 20th Century Fox and MGM Studios in Los Angeles. The production design team worked from Charles D. Hall's original sketches and blueprints, the actual design documents used on the 1931 Frankenstein, to reconstruct the castle and laboratory sets as authentically as possible. For the Transylvania train sequences, there was no existing stock footage of the kind of stark, bare-limbed trees, and low-hanging fog that the filmmakers needed. So, the crew built their own process plate on a soundstage, manufacturing the eerie countryside entirely from scratch. Only 2 sequences left the studio: the opening scenes at Frederick's Medical School, filmed at the University of Southern California, and the Puttin on the Ritz performance at the Mayfair Music Hall in Santa Monica. Everything else, the village, the graveyard, the torchlit countryside, the stone corridors of the castle, was built on a Los Angeles lot and lit to look like somewhere in Transylvania at the dead of night. Principal photography ran from February 19th to May 3rd, 1974, and wrapped without a single day shot on foreign soil. Detail 1. The name on the third brain jar belongs to a crew member. In the laboratory, a row of specimen jars lines one of the shelves, each one containing a preserved brain. On the third jar in the sequence, if you pause at exactly the right moment, you can make out the name Charles Certain. That is the real name of the film's assistant property master, the crew member responsible for organizing, tracking, and managing all the physical props on set. It's the kind of low-key joke that a props department would absolutely pull on a long shoot, slipping a colleague's name into a background detail where it has no business being, just to see if anyone notices. The vast majority of audiences across 50 years of screenings have never caught it, but it's sitting right there in frame, on the shelf, in every single lab scene. A small, quiet signature tucked into the background of one of the most carefully constructed comedies ever made. If you go back and watch tonight, you'll know exactly where to look. If you caught any of these the first time around, you have a sharper eye than most. And if this sends you back to the film for another look, that's time very well spent. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the films that have stayed with us for decades. There are plenty more classics worth revisiting, and we're just getting started.